Hey you. Yeah, you. Scrolling through the chaos of the internet, looking for something different. Well, tonight, you just found it. We're diving headfirst into a tale so ancient it predates your favorite myth, yet so oddly juicy it could definitely be the next streaming drama. Gods fighting over a mango tree? You can't make this stuff up, and lucky for you, you don't have to. This isn't some boring history lecture. It's a front row seat to absurdity, betrayal, and divine-level drama, all told in a way that lulls your brain and wakes your imagination. And trust me, you'll walk away not just entertained, but actually smarter. Weird, right? So here's the deal. If you like late-night brain candy with a dose of truth, smash that like, hit subscribe, and drop your City Plus local time in the comments, so we know who's vibing with us in the time stream tonight. Now dim the lights, cue that background hum, and let's unfold the madness of history together. You step into a small, timber-framed building. The sign outside promises grooming and healing. Inside, it smells like warm sweat, clove oil, and maybe, just maybe, someone's leftover blood. There's a chair, no cushion, no backrest, and instead of scissors, the tools lined up beside it gleam with the cold shimmer of iron hooks, blades, and something that looks alarmingly like a meat skewer. Welcome to the medieval barbershop, friend. You're not here just for a trim. You sink into the chair, because this is what people did back then. And as your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through warped glass windows, the barber pulls up a ragged cloth, ties it around your neck, and casually reaches for the leeches. This was standard, ordinary, routine. A man with minimal education, probably illiterate, wielding sharp instruments to treat headaches, balance humors, or get rid of that pesky bad blood that was clearly making you sad, cranky, or prone to nosebleeds. Haircut? Maybe, but mostly you're here to be opened up. They called it bloodletting. You call it a health hazard. The theory, if you can call it that, came straight out of ancient Greece and stuck around like a bad haircut. The body, they said, had four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Get them out of balance, and you were sick, angry, or possibly possessed. Solution? Let some blood spill and watch the mood lift. And so, the barber, who, by the way, probably had the steadiest hands in town thanks to years of beard trimming, became your go-to for opening a vein. The process? Tourniquet your arm, slice the vein, catch the blood in a bowl, and hope you didn't faint before they tied it off. Add a sniff of vinegar or shove some lavender under your nose, and boom, you were cleansed. There were tools for this. Fascinating, horrible tools. Brass bowls with measured markings, so they knew just how much of your life essence to remove. Some barbers got artistic about it, decorating their leech jars with ribbons or polishing their blood scoops until they shone. One particular favorite was the fleam, a spring-loaded blade that popped open like a tiny guillotine. Nothing says relax like a surprise wrist stab. You think your last haircut was stressful? At least no one asked if you wanted to drain 3 ounces or 4. And yet, this was normal, expected. Even the royalty participated. Charles II of England was known to have undergone bloodletting multiple times a year. In fact, historians still argue whether his death in 1685 was due to natural causes, or the overzealous bleeding sessions prescribed by his team of barbers and doctors. Oh yes, doctors. They existed, but they were few, expensive, and mostly theoretical. Real medicine? That was a noble ideal, but what people needed was someone available, and barbershops were available. Often, they were located next to bathhouses, because after a good steam, why not pop over and get a vein opened or a boil lanced? Efficiency at its finest. Picture this. You sit down for a haircut and watch the guy before you stagger out with a bloody rag pressed to his arm. You don't question it. That's just Tuesday. Maybe they put some rosemary under his nose to help him recover. Sometimes the barber would offer a cupping session, where they heated glass or horn cups and slapped them onto your back to suck your skin into big red welts. Supposedly, this drew out toxins. It mostly drew screams. Or you could try scarification, where they'd scratch patterns into your skin and then cup the bleeding parts. Aesthetic and therapeutic if you squint hard enough. Of course, tools were rarely sterilized. The concept of germs was centuries away. A wipe with a rag or a quick rinse in water was the closest thing to sanitation. So you might go in for a trim and come out with an infection that could fester for weeks, or kill you. Just another occupational hazard of medieval self-care. Now let's talk leeches. Yes, they really used them. The logic? Leeches sensed bad blood and would suck it right out. People believed this with such passion that nobles collected exotic leeches like today's influencers collect skincare serums. Leeches were imported, preserved, even farmed. There were actually leech shortages. Imagine that. A world where the rich panicked because they couldn't get their biannual leech cleanse. And if you didn't like leeches, you could opt for something called a barber's poultice. It usually included moldy bread, cow dung, crushed herbs, and a prayer. Slather it on your open wound and hope for the best, or the worst, depending on your tolerance for gangrene. The barbershop itself? Less of a serene salon, more of a community arena, a place for bloodletting, hair cutting, minor surgeries, teeth pulling, and, on occasion, impromptu musical performances. Yes, barbers sang, especially in Italy. It was thought to soothe patients, or at least drown out their screaming. That's not a joke. That's real history. And maybe, just maybe, it inspired the Barber of Seville. And then there's the infamous red and white pole. We'll dig into that later, but just know, it's not there because someone thought stripes were chic. That pole is a visual memory of bandaged arms, stained cloths, and a legacy soaked in more blood than style. At this point, you may be wondering why people kept going to these places. Why trust a guy with questionable hygiene and a belt full of knives? The answer is simple. He was all they had. And even more than that, he seemed to help. When the body felt hot, losing blood cooled it. When you were in pain, a ritual, even a terrifying one, offered hope. Medieval medicine was often psychological. If you believed the barber could cure you, sometimes your brain followed suit. It's easy to laugh now, but put yourself there. Your tooth aches, your skin burns with fever, you've been told your soul is out of balance, and the man in the red apron says he can fix it. Wouldn't you say yes too? Besides, the alternatives were worse. Like the village wise woman who'd dance in a circle around your sickbed while waving goose feathers. Or the priest who'd insist your boils were a punishment for lustful dreams. Compared to that, a guy with a sharp blade and some garlic paste starts looking not so bad. And yet, the dangers were real. People died from infections, excessive bleeding, or shock. There's even a rumor, never confirmed, that a barber once accidentally sliced the wrong vein on a nobleman and tried to stitch it back using horsehair. The man survived for a week. Still, you have to admire the confidence. No medical degree, barely any tools, and yet, barber surgeons strode through town like saviors with scissors. You'll see, this story only gets messier from here, because those blades, they didn't stop at wrists, not even close. You're still in the chair. The cloth is tighter now. The barber's fingers are sticky with something reddish-brown. And that glint in his eye? It's either focus or fatigue. You're not quite sure. The air smells metallic, and someone just walked in with a swollen jaw, holding what looks like a handkerchief soaked in drool and regret. Because this place, it's not just for hair, not even close. Barbers in the Middle Ages weren't just barbers. They were jacks of all painful trades. Stylists, sure. Surgeons, definitely. Dentists, bone setters, amateur therapists, and at times, midwives and battlefield medics. If it involved blood, pus, or body fluids of any kind, they were your guy. Not because they were particularly qualified, but because no one else wanted the job. The line between barber and surgeon was practically invisible for centuries. Physicians wrote prescriptions. They discussed theory, practiced astrology, and avoided direct contact with anything that actually bled. The barber surgeon, meanwhile, got down in the muck. He dealt with boils, broken bones, battlefield wounds, and unspeakable infections. You could say they were medieval multitaskers, with a toolkit full of horrors. On any given day, a barber might sharpen razors in the morning, extract 3 rotting teeth by noon, cauterize a sword wound by afternoon, and clip a monk's tonsure before dinner. He didn't need a medical license, just a steady hand, a high tolerance for screams, and ideally, a bucket for vomit. Let's start with the surgeries. Imagine you've been stabbed in the thigh by a jealous farmer. It's deep, but not fatal, yet. You limp to the barber shop, blood leaking through your trousers, and beg for help. The barber nods solemnly, lays you across a blood-stained bench, and pulls out his tools. A probe, which looks suspiciously like a fireplace poker, a rusty hook, a hot iron for sealing the wound, and, if you're lucky, some powdered herbs for the pain. Anesthesia? Forget it. Maybe a gulp of wine, maybe a wooden stick to bite. Definitely screaming, probably weeping. The barber's assistant, if he has one, might sit on your legs to keep you from thrashing, and after the wound is cleaned, the iron is heated until it glows, and pressed into your flesh to seal the vessel. The smell of burning skin fills the room, and if you pass out, well, that's considered a blessing. Historians still argue whether barber surgeons caused more harm than good with battlefield surgeries, especially since infections often set in afterward. But on the flip side, they were the only ones even attempting to help. On medieval battlefields, barbers weren't just cutting hair. They were cutting away gangrene, amputating limbs, and sewing up gashes with horsehair and courage. And some of them actually got good at it. By the 13th century, barber surgeons were organized into guilds. They had apprentices, rules, and even uniforms, but their training, spotty at best. You didn't go to barber college, you watched someone else do it. Maybe you practiced on pigs, then you practiced on people. Trial and horrifying error. Of course, not all barber surgeons were equal. Some were itinerant, wandering from town to town with a bag of blades and a grin. Others had permanent shops, trusted by their communities, but none of them had access to anesthesia, antiseptics, or reliable anatomy texts. Most had never seen the inside of a human body, except the ones they'd hacked open themselves, and yet they operated on everything. Cataracts with needles, bladder stones with metal rods, hernias, by pushing them back in and sewing the hole shut, and even brain injuries. Trepanation, the drilling of holes into the skull to relieve pressure, was practiced well into the Renaissance, and sometimes, shockingly, it worked. Then there were amputations. Let's say you caught your leg in a wagon wheel, and now it's purple and smells like rotting cheese. The barber takes one look and sighs. It has to come off, he says, like he's talking about a split end. He wraps your leg, straps you down, and sharpens the saw. You get a slug of spirits and a dirty rag to chew. Then, the sawing begins. Speed was everything. A good barber could remove a leg in under 2 minutes. They'd tie off the arteries with linen thread or silk, maybe apply pitch or tar to the stump, and hope for the best. Some patients died of shock, some lived. A few even recovered fully, if they didn't get infected first. The tools were brutal. Bone saws, forceps, lancets, scalpels, hooks, and something called the cautery iron, basically a branding iron used to burn blood vessels shut. And these instruments, rarely cleaned, passed from patient to patient like party favors at a medieval trauma club. But barbers weren't just surgeons, they were also dentists, or more accurately, tooth yankers. Tooth decay was rampant. Sugar was becoming popular among the wealthy, but oral hygiene lagged far behind. So when your molar ached with infection, you went to the barber. He'd jam a metal key or a pair of giant forceps into your mouth, wiggle until something cracked, and pull. If the tooth shattered, he'd dig around for the root. No Novocaine, no numbing gel, just pain, and maybe a swig of ale. In fact, the tooth key was one of the most dreaded tools in the barber's kit. It looked like a door key, but had a claw instead of teeth. The barber would hook it around the tooth and twist, hard. It worked about half the time. The rest? Jaw fractures, gum tears, or dislocated mouths. And that's not all. Some barbers offered cures for bad breath that involved rinsing with urine. Yes, urine. Others burned herbs under your nose to smoke out evil spirits. One even claimed that humming Gregorian chants while chewing mint leaves could align your jaw chakras. Spoiler, it did not. You begin to understand why barbers were both feared and beloved. They were accessible, often cheaper than physicians, and willing to get their hands dirty, literally. But they were also unregulated, experimental, and sometimes downright reckless. One bad shave could lead to sepsis. One wrong pull could dislocate your jaw. And yet people lined up. They kept coming back. Why? Partly because of ritual. The barber's chair was a place of release, of transformation, of painful hope. If you were suffering, you could at least do something about it. Even if that something involved hot irons and a side of trauma. And partly because, well, there wasn't much choice. Still, barbers weren't monsters. Many took pride in their work. Some even invented tools still used today, like curved forceps or specialized scalpels. And there were whispers of miracle recoveries. A woman who survived a breast tumor removal. A man who regained speech after a skull fracture was drained. Were they true? Hard to say. But the barbers certainly believed them. And over time, their role grew. They attended childbirths. They shaved monks. They performed autopsies. They accompanied soldiers into battle. And in cities like Paris and London, they eventually petitioned to be recognized as legitimate surgeons. Some even wrote treatises, like the 14th century Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac, a barber surgeon whose influence shaped European medicine for centuries. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The professional physicians, they were livid. How dare these unwashed blade wielders perform surgeries without Latin degrees? The tension between barbers and real doctors boiled for centuries. We'll get into that turf war soon. But for now, you're still in the chair. The barber's wiping sweat from his brow. You've lost a tooth, a pint of blood, and possibly your dignity. But hey, your fever's down. Your pulse is steady. Maybe this guy does know what he's doing. Or maybe you're just lucky. Either way, you walk out a little woozy, a little wobbly, but still alive. Which, in medieval terms, is a pretty good day at the barber's. You're back on the dusty street, the barber's door swinging shut behind you. Your arms wrapped in cloth. Your mouth tastes vaguely of blood and regret. And you swear your soul just left your body during that tooth extraction. But as you shuffle past the wooden post out front, something catches your eye. That pole, red and white, spiraling like a twisted candy cane from medieval hell. It's oddly festive for a place that just removed someone's infected molar with a device resembling a crowbar. But make no mistake, that pole, it's a warning label. A centuries-old symbol of pain, pride, and public advertising. Let's decode it. Today, we see the barber's pole as a nostalgic bit of retro charm. Kitschy, harmless, like the carousel of grooming. But in medieval Europe, that pole spoke a language everyone understood. Red for blood, white for bandages, and the pole itself, that represented the wooden staff you'd grip while your barber sliced into your vein. Not exactly the soothing message you get from modern barbers offering beard oils and neck massages. You'd walk by, see the red and white spiral, and know instantly, this was a place for haircuts, yes, but also for minor surgeries, bloodletting, and any number of procedures too gruesome for polite conversation. The pole likely began with the actual staff people held during bloodletting. Picture it. The barber ties a cloth around your arm to pump up the veins, hands you a stick to squeeze, then slices. The pole steadied your shaking hand. Over time, Barbers would hang the bloodied cloths out to dry, twisting in the wind, wrapping around the pole in a spiral. Someone decided to paint that spiral permanently, and thus a symbol was born. In England, the red and white colors became official markers. Barbers displayed them to show they were licensed to practice their arts. Some poles even had a brass basin at the top or bottom, representing the bowl used to collect blood. Charming, right? And it wasn't just tradition, it was branding. Before printed business cards or Google reviews, your pole did the talking. You'd be walking through a new town, needing a haircut or possibly emergency limb removal, and that swirling icon would be your beacon, like a medieval neon sign screaming, "Open for business and open your veins while you're at it." Eventually, some regions added blue to the mix, particularly in America. Why? There are theories. One says it represented veins, to complement the red for blood and white for bandages. Another says it was simply a patriotic nod to the American flag. Historians still argue whether the blue stripe had real symbolic meaning or was just a fashionable flourish. Whatever the case, the pole endured. Through plagues, revolutions, and the slow march of hygiene standards, the barber's pole twirled on, a spinning relic of blood-soaked legacy. But more than that, it reflected the barber's complicated identity. They weren't just groomers, they were healers, execution assistants, midwives, battlefield technicians. The pole was their claim to legitimacy. It told the world, we do more than trim beards. Still, not everyone appreciated the message. By the late Middle Ages, professional physicians were trying to draw a hard line. Real medicine was a scholarly pursuit. Latin texts, university robes, and celestial alignments. Barbers, by contrast, were working-class craftsmen. They practiced with hands, not books, and that barber's pole, it became a point of contention, a red and white symbol of a deeper debate. Who has the right to heal? The tension grew until barbering and surgery split, sometimes messily. In England, for example, the 1540 Act of Union formally united barbers and surgeons into one company, the Company of Barber Surgeons. But with a twist. Barbers could continue shaving and minor procedures, while surgeons were granted more serious medical rights. You could cut hair or cut into people, but not both unless licensed. The pole, though, remained a shared icon, because history loves a good paradox. Even in cities like Paris, the barber's pole was so ingrained in culture that it remained long after barbers stopped bleeding people. It took centuries, laws, and eventually germ theory to pull the razor out of their hands, but the spiral stuck. There's something poetic about it. The same pole that once announced a place of pain now twirls above salons offering lavender-scented scalp massages, its history spinning in plain sight. A visual callback to an age when health, grooming, and agony all lived under one roof. And if you think that's weird, wait until you hear about the guy who once tried to light the pole on fire during a plague outbreak, thinking it was cursed. Spoiler, it wasn't. But hey, people were desperate, and superstitious, and very, very confused about hygiene. Let's not forget, this was an era when people believed bad smells caused disease. So a barber could technically help fight off illness by giving you a rosemary-scented shave, because obviously your sweaty upper lip was the source of the Black Death. Speaking of which, that red stripe on the pole? In plague years, it took on darker meanings. Bloodletting was a common treatment for plague victims, often worsening the patient's condition. And because barbers were the ones doing the cutting, their poles became eerie symbols of survival, or the lack thereof. You'd walk past one during an outbreak and feel a chill. That pole meant there were scalpels inside, maybe hope, maybe horror. Still, people went in, even when physicians advised against it, even when others whispered that barbers were spreading the disease more than curing it. Those red and white poles drew in the desperate, because when you're sick and scared, you look for anything that offers relief. Even a spiral painted in blood and bandage. It's wild how a symbol can outlive the practice it represented. Today, that pole is all but detached from its origins. You see it spinning and think of clippers and aftershave, not cauterization and forced dentistry, but it's still there, still spinning, and once you know its history, you can't unsee it. You'll walk past one tomorrow, maybe, and remember this. That pole once meant pain. It meant risk. It meant trust in a man with no degree, a dirty apron, and a very sharp knife. And yet, somehow, that spiral also means resilience. It's the story of how barbers clawed their way into medicine, not always elegantly, not always ethically, but with real consequences. Lives were saved, lives were lost, and somewhere in the middle, a pole kept spinning. You'd think people would have rejected such a gory legacy, but instead they painted it pretty, leaned into the swirl, and let history soften into nostalgia. And that's one of the weirdest things about the human brain. We take horror and, given enough time, turn it into decor. The pole is still twirling behind you, mocking you slightly, now that you know its secrets. The red isn't festive, the white isn't clean, and yet, people still walk by without a clue, blissfully unaware that they're passing a monument to centuries of gory guesswork. But step a little deeper into the past, and you'll find something even juicier than the pole, the rivalry. Not all bloodletting was created equal, and not all who wielded blades were considered equals. In fact, the Middle Ages saw one of the most awkward turf wars in the history of health. Physicians versus barbers, a professional grudge match that lasted centuries, and often came down to who could convince the public they were less likely to kill you. You had physicians, educated, often Latin-speaking, university-trained men of status. They wore long robes and velvet caps. They didn't like touching patients, preferring to diagnose from a safe distance. They used astrology, urine charts, and the writings of Galen and Hippocrates as their guidebooks. To them, disease wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. The stars could mess up your liver, apparently. And then you had barbers, hands-on, calloused, often barely literate. Their classroom was the barber shop, their textbooks were people, and their tools came from blacksmiths, not scholars. They got dirty, they touched wounds, they cut, drained, stitched, and cauterized with an alarming level of confidence and very little formal oversight. Guess who the people trusted more? That's right, most folks chose the guy who actually did things. Because while physicians were diagnosing you with melancholy of the spleen and suggesting warm compresses while Mercury entered retrograde, the barber was in your house, lancing the pus out of your ankle and making sure you didn't die from it. This, understandably, irritated the doctors a lot. By the 13th century, the tension had boiled over into open disputes. In Paris, university-trained physicians tried to ban barbers from performing surgeries altogether. They argued that barbers lacked the education, the decorum, and frankly, the breeding to be involved in matters of the human body. Barbers responded by continuing to do the work anyway. Why? Because the demand was overwhelming. Wars, famines, plague, all of these created a constant need for hands-on medical care. Barbers filled that need, and as cities grew, so did the need for regulation, or at least the illusion of it. So the authorities came up with a compromise. In 1210, the Collège de Saint-Côme was founded in Paris, essentially a guild for professional surgeons, distinct from both physicians and barbers. These surgeons were supposed to be the real surgical experts, trained and vetted, but still not quite on the same level as physicians. Meanwhile, barber surgeons continued operating, often learning on the job or through apprenticeships. The result? A three-tiered system. Physicians at the top, educated, respected, but distant. Surgeons in the middle, skilled but not scholarly. And barber surgeons at the bottom, hands-on, street-level medics with a reputation for both usefulness and chaos. But here's where it gets murky, because despite their lower status, barbers were everywhere. They worked in towns, on battlefields, in castles, and even inside monasteries. Some became so skilled that noble families requested them by name. A few wrote treatises, created new surgical instruments, or developed innovative techniques. Their work was gritty, but undeniably necessary, and so the boundary lines blurred. Sometimes barbers performed procedures officially reserved for surgeons. Sometimes surgeons refused to get their hands dirty, and the barbers picked up the slack. In 1540, Henry VIII finally tried to unify the chaos in England by creating the Company of Barber Surgeons, merging the two professions under one institutional roof. It was like pairing cats and dogs into the same kennel. The company had strict rules. Barbers could cut hair and perform minor surgeries, like bloodletting and tooth pulling, but not amputations or internal procedures. Surgeons, meanwhile, weren't allowed to shave beards or style wigs. This might sound ridiculous now, but at the time, it was a serious division of labor. Imagine losing your job because you trimmed a mustache without the proper paperwork. But the rivalry didn't end there. For decades, barbers and surgeons within the same company squabbled over turf. Barbers felt disrespected. Surgeons felt tainted by association. The barber's pole, once a symbol of broad healing, now became a marker of professional inferiority. It screamed, "This guy's not a real doctor." The split finally came in 1745. The surgeons, tired of sharing space with what they saw as glorified hairdressers, broke away and formed the Company of Surgeons, which later evolved into the Royal College of Surgeons. The barbers were left behind, legally prohibited from performing any kind of surgical procedure. Their era of scalpels and saws was over. Well, mostly. Some barbers still dabbled, illegally, quietly, especially in rural areas where doctors were rare and desperate people didn't ask for credentials. But officially, the age of the barber surgeon had ended. And yet, if you look closely, the traces linger. Take the modern barbershop layout: the chair, the mirror, the tray of tools lined up like surgical instruments. There's something ritualistic about it, something medical, and that's no accident. It's a cultural memory, baked into the design by centuries of blood, hair, and muscle memory. Even the word barber comes from the Latin barba, meaning beard, but in practice it once meant so much more. Here's a quirky tidbit for your mental scrapbook. In the Middle Ages, some barbers were so feared for their medical work that clients insisted on a second opinion. From a priest, not a physician. That's right. In some towns, barbers needed clerical blessings before lancing anything larger than a pimple. It wasn't just about infection, it was about morality. Pain and healing were considered divine domains, and messing with them could land you in spiritual hot water. Even royalty got involved. King Louis IX of France, for instance, mandated that barbers working in his court undergo periodic inspections, not just for skill, but for cleanliness. And by cleanliness, we mean not smelling like a dead goat. Hygiene standards were relative after all. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this rivalry is how little it changed people's behavior. Despite legal crackdowns, despite public shaming and the occasional lawsuit, people kept going to barbers. Because when you needed a boil lanced, a splinter pulled, or a suspicious lump removed, the guy down the street with steady hands and a pair of tongs was a safer bet than waiting 3 weeks for a university-trained physician to consult his star chart. It was practical, it was local, it was medieval healthcare in action. And for centuries, this uneasy truce between knowledge and experience, theory and practice, defined medicine itself. Today we separate things neatly. Doctors are highly trained, barbers cut hair, and never the twain shall meet. But for a long time, those lines weren't just blurred. They were covered in blood, ash, and the occasional leech. So the next time you step into a sleek, minimalist barbershop with indie music and beard balm, remember this. Once upon a time, your haircut came with a side of battlefield surgery. And that stylish barber's pole? It's a ghost of a rivalry still echoing through history. You're starting to feel like you've been through something. You've survived a shave that turned into surgery, walked away from a blood-slicked barber's chair, and ducked out just before the neighborhood physician filed another complaint about unauthorized molar removals. And just when you think it can't get more absurd, your tooth starts to throb. Of course it does. So you limp back down the alley to the only person in town who might help. The guy who sharpened his blade on the windowsill and hums Gregorian chants while sorting his leeches. You're going to the barber, for dentistry. To say medieval dental care was crude is like saying the sun's a little warm. It was brutal, fast, traumatic, and overwhelmingly painful. Toothaches weren't just annoying, they were catastrophic. A rotting molar could swell your face, infect your bloodstream, and leave you moaning in agony for weeks. And who answered that call? Not the physician, not the priest, the barber. This wasn't a calm reclining chair situation with x-rays and peppermint rinse. No. This was a wooden bench, a stiff drink, and a guy with tools better suited for carpentry. The main tool of the trade? The dental key. A metal rod with a claw at one end, resembling a key used to open a medieval dungeon. The barber would jam it into your mouth, hook it around the offending tooth, and crank. It didn't just pull the tooth, it twisted it, sometimes snapping the crown off and leaving the root behind to fester. There were no gloves, no mouthwash, no count to 3. Just you, the barber, a rusty tool, and whatever gods you still believed in. Barbers had other options too. Forceps the size of garden shears, long metal spikes to pry out shattered bits. And if all else failed, they'd break the tooth into pieces and dig them out one by one. Sometimes they'd cauterize the hole with a hot iron to stop the spirit of decay, which is either deeply mystical or a nice way of saying, we're about to light your mouth on fire. Historians still argue whether barbers made dental problems better or worse. On one hand, getting the rotten tooth out was the only way to end the pain. On the other hand, unsterilized tools and splintered roots could cause infections worse than the original ache. Some victims, patients, died of jaw abscesses that reached the brain. Others lived, albeit toothless and traumatized. And yet, again, people came, over and over, because what else could they do? Toothpaste didn't exist. Mouthwash was usually wine, vinegar, or someone's urine, depending on who you asked. A few remedies included ground sheep bone, burnt bread, crushed mint, and honey. Yes, they put honey on teeth, which is basically like extinguishing a fire with gasoline. Some people believed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms living in your teeth. If this sounds too weird to be true, it's not. It was a widespread theory for centuries. How did they treat these imaginary worms? Well, one method involved placing a hot onion or clove directly on the aching tooth, then standing over steam and chanting. Another involved smoking the tooth with henbane seeds, and then listening closely for squealing, supposedly the worm's death cry. If you heard nothing, just smoke it again. Maybe your tooth needed more seasoning. So yes, the barbers might have been terrifying, but they weren't the most terrifying option. Of course, there were superstitions. So many. People tied dead moles around their necks. They stuck frog skins in their mouths. They chewed candle wax soaked in holy water. One popular tradition involved whispering a prayer into a stone and then throwing it into a river, believing the pain would drift away with the current. Spoiler, it did not. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, barbers became the de facto experts. Maybe because they had actual tools. Maybe because they were brave or reckless enough to take action. And some of them got really good at it. They'd develop techniques, know how to numb a nerve with pressure, or gently loosen a root with herbs and thyme. It wasn't science, but it was experience. Weirdly, barbers sometimes even fashioned replacement teeth. If you lost a front tooth and didn't want to look like a pirate, a barber might offer you a prosthetic. It could be made of wood, ivory, or even someone else's tooth, usually taken from a dead body or a poor soul desperate enough to sell one. The new tooth would be lashed into your mouth with wire, twine, or strips of dried gut. It wasn't pretty, but it was something. Early dentures were a mix of bones, metal, and desperation. In fact, the 15th century saw the rise of what were called dental artisans. Basically, specialized barbers who focused on teeth. They'd travel from town to town with cases full of tools, bragging about their ability to cure bad breath, extract pain, or fix a crooked smile. Some even carved false teeth that were painted to match their clients' remaining molars. Custom, medieval cosmetic dentistry, for the right price, of course. There were even barbers who dabbled in tooth tattoos. No, not decorative ink. This involved cauterizing tiny symbols onto molars, usually as a way to mark evil spirits or heal recurring pain. The symbol could be religious or astrological, and once it was burned in place, well, at least you didn't have to worry about that tooth anymore. Now, in terms of prestige, barber dentistry was still low on the totem pole. Physicians didn't want to touch teeth. They thought it was too grimy, too physical, too beneath them. And so the barber filled the gap, literally and figuratively. They became experts out of necessity, street-level surgeons of the mouth. But make no mistake, there was no dental license, no regulation. One town's brilliant tooth puller could be another town's babbling lunatic with pliers. You might get your smile back, or lose half your jaw. Still, you'd go. You'd go because the pain was unbearable, because there was no anesthetic, because the priest said it was a curse, but the barber said he could fix it, because maybe, just maybe, you'd be the lucky one who walked out feeling better. And here's the real kicker. Some barbers turn dental work into public entertainment. Picture a town square. People gather. The barber sets up a platform. He announces he'll pull 3 teeth in under 2 minutes. Maybe he juggles his tools. Maybe he wears a mask or a feathered hat. A volunteer climbs up, face pale, jaw swollen, and the crowd watches in horrified delight. Blood sprays, the tooth clatters into a tin pan, and the people cheer. It was pain. It was theater. It was medicine and madness blended into one grotesque afternoon show. And through it all, the barber stood at the center, scalpel in one hand, forceps in the other, smile wide. Was he a healer, a showman, a lunatic? Maybe all 3. You shake your head, mouth still aching, and step back from the barbershop with a new respect, or fear, probably both. Because in this world, healthcare doesn't come in a white coat. It comes wrapped in a blood-streaked apron, carrying a bone saw, and a surprisingly optimistic attitude. You don't have to like it, you just have to survive it. You're starting to realize something important. Every trip to the medieval barber came with a very real chance of walking out lighter, of blood, teeth, dignity, or all 3. But now we've arrived at what might be the strangest corner of the barber's business. The mysterious world of leeches, lances, and lunacy. You didn't just visit your friendly neighborhood blade slinger for a shave or a yanked molar. No, sometimes you showed up because your spirit felt off. And the solution? Something between ancient science and an exorcism, with a dash of animal guts. Let's start with the leeches. By now you know they weren't just floating around in swamps waiting to ruin your lakeside vacation. These squishy little bloodsuckers were valued medical tools. Medieval barbers believed leeches could sense bad blood, the kind that caused fever, melancholy, or, if your humors were really out of whack, excessive poetry writing. So when you complained of dizziness or a sluggish heart, the barber didn't ask about your diet or your stress levels. He reached for the jar. Inside, a murky stew of sluggish, writhing leeches, some the size of a child's pinky finger. He'd fish one out, plop it on your skin, wrist, neck, maybe behind the ear, and wait for the tiny vampire to latch on. The sensation? Cold, squirmy, then sharp, followed by a weird numbness as your blood drained away. Some people swore by it, said it cleared their heads. Others fainted on the spot. And yes, these leeches were reused, maybe rinsed, maybe not. The logic was medieval. If it looked alive, it worked. But leeches were just one of the methods in the barber's overflowing bag of bizarre. If you were truly unwell, spitting blood, coughing up black bile, or just plain acting weird, they might take it a step further. Enter the lancing ritual. Let's say you've got a mysterious swelling on your arm. It's hot, it's angry looking, and the local priest is whispering about demonic interference. The barber's diagnosis? It's congested blood, and it needs out, now. He sterilizes his lancet by holding it over a candle for a few seconds. Progress. Then he slices. The wound splits, and blood, hopefully, oozes out. If pus joins the party, you're halfway to a diagnosis. If worms come out, you've officially entered the nightmare zone. To help things along, he might slap on a poultice made from ingredients you'd normally associate with a bad kitchen accident. Raw garlic, stale beer, ground snails, or even cow dung. Some believe the heat from the dung drew out toxins. Others just shrugged and hoped for divine intervention. And if the swelling didn't go down, they might bleed you again. Or try something more extreme. Cauterization, branding, or cupping. With cupping, the barber would heat a glass or brass cup, then press it against your skin to create a suction blister. The goal was to pull out the illness. The result? Big angry circles, and possibly a scar to match your fever. Modern science calls it pseudoscience, but to people then, it was treatment, ritual, hope. And then, there were the humors. No, not humor as in jokes, though medieval barbers could probably use a laugh. We're talking about the ancient Greek system of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Keep them in balance and you were healthy. Let one dominate and suddenly you're throwing things at your neighbor, crying in the marketplace, or spending your days sketching unsettling birds. A barber might look at your tongue and declare your bile too hot, or your pulse too strong, or your sweat too sour. The solution? Adjust the humors. How? Through diet, bloodletting, and often purging. Yes, purging. This meant inducing vomiting or, the other kind of release. Barbers had herbal concoctions for both. Some were brewed with rhubarb root, senna, or powdered beetles. One particularly wild potion included fermented mare's milk, onion juice, and a pinch of ash. If you kept it down, you were probably fine. If you didn't, well, that was the point. And if things really got weird, if your eyes rolled back, if you spoke in tongues, if you started convulsing, they might not call it illness at all. They might call it possession. Now, to be clear, most barbers weren't priests. But when things got desperate, lines blurred. Some kept spirit manuals with prayers or chants to drive out the demon of bile. One Italian barber was known for humming psalms while bleeding patients with seizures. Another claimed he could read sickness through the hair and would burn clippings on his hearth to watch the smoke curl. Straight smoke? You're fine. Spiral smoke? Better get your affairs in order. Barbers became part healer, part shaman. Especially in rural towns where no trained doctors ever visited, they were the closest thing to medical authority, however shaky that authority might be. And because they operated outside traditional academic circles, their methods mixed science, folklore, and just plain guesswork, like boiling lizard tails to make eye drops, or wrapping feet in cabbage to cure insomnia. Okay, maybe we should bring that one back. One German barber in the 14th century even wrote about treating heartbreak. His method? A rose petal infusion, rubbed directly onto the chest, followed by light cupping to draw out the sadness. Whether it worked is unclear, but it definitely beat being bled for unrequited love. And here's a fringe tidbit. Some barbers moonlighted as dream interpreters. You'd describe your nightmares, usually involving wolves, rivers, or flying teeth, and they'd suggest a treatment. Bad dream about drowning? You've got excess phlegm. Drink a pepper broth. Dreamed of fire? Too much bile. Cool it with cucumber water and say 3 Hail Marys. Historians still argue whether these practices were more placebo than prescription. But even if the results were sketchy, the belief was real. People trusted the barber because he acted, he did something, and sometimes that was all anyone needed. You might think, after all this, that people would eventually lose faith. that they'd stop showing up to get lanced, purged, or smoked out like a cursed ham, but they didn't. Because no matter how chaotic it seemed, the medieval barbershop offered one thing above all else: hope in action. Sure, you left with a few more scars, maybe a leech in your sock, but you also left feeling like something had been done. Your humors were stirred, your blood was aired out, your sadness had been drawn through your chest by rose petals and steam, and if nothing else, you had a great story for the tavern. And in a world ruled by plague, superstition, and aching teeth, that was enough. You're back in that chair again, trying not to focus on the dried something crusted on the edge of the basin next to you. The barber, same guy, always humming, always smiling, is sharpening a knife that could pass for a pirate's weapon. You came for a shave, but you're staying for the social commentary, because tonight's client before you is someone important. Really important. You catch a glimpse of his robes, velvet, embroidered cuffs, a glint of jewelry at the collar. This isn't just some village drunk getting his ear hair trimmed. This is a man with influence, a noble, maybe even a cleric. And he's here, sitting in the same chair where a peasant bled out just last week. That's the paradox of the medieval barbershop. No one was too high-born to escape the blade. Barbers served everyone, from beggars to bishops, paupers to popes. Whether you wore a burlap tunic or a jewel-encrusted cape, if your boils needed lancing or your soul needed purging through your wrists, you sat in that chair like everyone else. And if you were lucky, your barber was discreet. Take Pope Clement VI. During the Black Death, his barber surgeon was one of the few people allowed to come near him, not because he was holy, but because someone had to change the poultices and keep his tonsure neat. In fact, some barbers became so trusted by the church that they were unofficial confessors. Think about that. The guy who shaved your chin might also know where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. It's wild, right? The same hands that held down a squirming farmer during an impromptu tooth extraction could be gently anointing the back of a bishop's scalp. That duality was the norm, and it wasn't just about access, it was about image. Clean-shaven faces, trimmed beards, and neat tonsures weren't fashion statements. They were spiritual signifiers. In monastic orders, shaving the crown of the head, the tonsure, was a sacred act, a visual commitment to God. And guess who made sure those sacred circles stayed sacredly circular? You already know. Barbers entered monasteries not just with razors, but with reverence. They were trained, sometimes unofficially, in church doctrine, enough to understand when to speak and when to shut up. And their role? Essential, just like scribes, cooks, or almoners, but with more risk of accidental decapitation. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about that. Some clergy were suspicious. After all, barbers weren't ordained. They didn't wear robes. They didn't study Latin. What right did they have to touch holy men, much less cut them? And yet, someone had to do it. The monks themselves weren't trusted to handle blades around their own scalps. Too risky, too unclean, too much room for ear loss. So the church allowed it. Grudgingly, then customarily. And over time, barbers became fixtures in religious spaces. They knew the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. They knew who needed shaving before which feast. They even helped prepare the dead, trimming and cleaning corpses before burial. A final grooming, so to speak, before passing into the afterlife. And their services extended far beyond the church walls. In royal courts, barbers were often part of the private staff, quietly vital, always nearby. They cut hair, yes, but they also bled kings. They treated skin ailments. They whispered, observed, and occasionally reported. Because when you're close enough to a monarch's neck to feel his pulse, you also hear things, secrets, suspicions, sins. There's even a famous case in 15th century France where a barber's testimony was key in exposing a treasonous plot. The details? He overheard a conversation while powdering a nobleman's wig. Just a simple snip-snip, then betrayal. And yet, while barbers brushed shoulders with the elite, they never quite became elite. They were servants, craftsmen, respected in function, but not in form. The nobleman might trust him with a boil on his thigh, but he'd never invite him to dinner. The bishop might confess to him in a fevered moment, but would never mention it again. Barbers lived in that strange in-between space, too useful to ignore, too lowly to embrace. But sometimes, just sometimes, the lines blurred. One record from medieval England tells of a barber who became the unofficial advisor to a local count. Why? Because he was the only one willing to lance a cyst on the count's backside during a siege. For days, the count writhed in pain while his surgeons argued about procedure. The barber walked in, cut it open, drained it, and walked out. No charge, no fuss, just relief. The count promoted him on the spot. There were others too, barbers who were knighted, barbers who ran hospitals, barbers who married into wealth. They were rare, but they existed, living proof that sometimes a sharp blade and steady hands could carve out a better life. But the danger was just as real. Being close to power is thrilling until power turns on you. Barbers were often scapegoats when things went wrong. A noble died from infection? Must have been the barber's fault. A king fell ill after a shave? The blade was cursed. The barber was hanged. They were convenient suspects, easy to blame, hard to defend. And still people kept coming back. Because when you woke up with a growth on your neck, or a suspicious swelling behind your ear, you didn't write a letter to a university in Italy. You went to the shop down the street, knocked twice, and hoped your barber had slept well. Even plague victims came. Yes, especially plague victims. Because when the swelling started and the black boils rose, most people fled. But some barbers stayed. They bled the sick, drained the buboes, cleaned the sores, sometimes because they were brave, sometimes because they had no choice. And the tools they used, horrifying? There was the plague knife, curved, jagged, and used to slice open the swellings. There was the plague spoon, used to scoop out infected tissue. And there was the plague mask, stuffed with herbs. More symbolic than protective, but at least it showed they cared. Historians still argue whether barbers spread the plague more than they helped treat it. After all, they rarely washed their hands. Their tools were cleaned in whatever was nearby, often ale or wine. They moved from patient to patient without gloves, aprons soaked in sweat and gore. But again, they were there. That counts for something. They showed up when others didn't. And in the chaos of the Black Death, that made them heroes. Or at least necessary risks. And just like that, you realize, the barbershop wasn't just a place for grooming. It was a theater of survival, a confessional booth, a war zone, a temple. Because whether you were a monk, a monarch, or just some poor soul with a toothache and no friends, you sat in that same wooden chair. And if the barber liked you, maybe he'd hum a lullaby while he stitched your face back together. But if he didn't, well, hope you said your prayers. So here you are again, back on your feet, maybe missing a tooth, maybe stitched up from the latest attempt to remove a suspicious lump. You've walked out of the barber's shop with your dignity mostly intact and your humors allegedly rebalanced. You should feel better, but something gnaws at the back of your mind. What if the barber made things worse? That question wasn't just yours. It was one that rattled through medieval cities, whispered in plague-ridden alleys, muttered under the breath of noblemen whose fevers didn't break. Because as strange as it sounds, the man meant to keep you alive might have been the one who killed you, not by malice, but by method. Let's talk about how barbers, despite their best intentions, became unlikely accomplices to the worst health crisis in history, the Black Death, the plague, the Great Mortality. Whatever you want to call it, it tore across Europe in the mid-14th century like wildfire through dry hay. People died by the millions, cities emptied, families vanished overnight. And as physicians threw up their hands and priests rang their bells, barbers kept working. Why? Because people still had buboes to lance. Teeth still rotted, fevers still burned. In an age when disease came wrapped in terror and mystery, the barber's chair became both a last resort and sometimes a final resting place. And that's where things got dangerous, because the barber's tools, those hooks, razors, and lancets, were never clean, not in the modern sense. A quick rinse in a bowl of wine, maybe a wipe with a dirty cloth, and back into the pouch they went. There was no germ theory, no hand sanitizer, just sweat, blood, and faith. A barber might treat 5 plague victims in a row, then move straight to a healthy customer with nothing more than a shrug and a cracked joke. That same blade that opened an infected lymph node might then trim your beard, or cut a corn from your foot, or pull a molar from your jaw. It doesn't take a modern epidemiologist to see the problem. Some historians believe barbers were among the unintentional superspreaders of plague. Their job required physical closeness, direct contact with fluids, and shared tools. And unlike most people, they didn't flee when the plague arrived. They stayed open, sometimes because they felt duty-bound, sometimes because business boomed when panic took hold. There are accounts of barbers moving from house to house, treating families in isolation, noble homes, monasteries, even plague hospitals. In one Italian city, a barber treated 78 patients over 2 weeks, and died on the 15th day. He may have helped some, but how many did he infect in the process? It's impossible to say for sure, of course. Historians still argue whether the plague spread more through fleas and rats, or person-to-person contact, but it's safe to assume that slicing open oozing sores with a shared blade didn't help. And then there's the matter of intentional treatments that made things worse. Bleeding plague victims was one of the most common responses to infection. The logic was based on humoral theory. Get the bad blood out, and the body can recover. But the reality? Most victims were already dehydrated, weak, and fragile. Bleeding them didn't help. It sped things up. Some barbers would bleed a victim at the first sign of swelling, only to have the patient collapse and die mid-procedure. Others used heated irons to cauterize buboes, believing fire could purge the poison. The result? Agony, shock, often death. And yet, these practices persisted, because what else was there? No antibiotics, no antivirals, no clue. You were sick. You wanted someone to do something. And the barber, blade in hand, offered action, even if it was the wrong action. And here's the chilling part. They weren't always wrong. In some cases, opening a bubo, the swollen lymph node associated with bubonic plague, did relieve pressure. It did release fluid. Some people survived. And when that happened, it reinforced the entire cycle. People saw it, believed it, and lined up. Barbers gained a weird sort of plague celebrity. Some even wore medallions or talismans to show they had survived the work. Others charged extra during outbreaks. Hazard pay, you might say. And in the cities that suffered the worst, barber surgeons were often memorialized in records, not as villains, but as the ones who stayed. While physicians locked their doors, barbers walked into danger. Whether it was bravery, desperation, or sheer ignorance didn't always matter. Still, the line between help and harm remained razor-thin. One infamous case tells of a London barber who worked tirelessly through a local plague outbreak, treating dozens of patients in a single week. His home became a makeshift clinic. He washed wounds, drained buboes, even stitched open abscesses. Then one day he collapsed in the middle of a procedure. The infection had reached him. By nightfall he was dead. By the end of the week, so was his wife, and their apprentice, and the 3 patients waiting on the floor. The shop was boarded up and burned, gone, just like that. And what did the neighbors remember? That he cared. Because here's the emotional knot at the center of it all. Even when they were dangerous, barbers were trying to help. They worked through pandemics, bled the dying, lanced the boils no one else would touch. They weren't villains, they were survivors, just like everyone else. Survivors who happened to carry knives. In the quiet moments, after the screams, after the fevered prayers, you might find a barber wiping down his blade with wine, whispering a prayer of his own. Not because it helped, but because it was all he had. And somehow, even amid all this risk, people kept trusting them. They walked into shops knowing there might be plague in the air. They sat in chairs that smelled like iron and oil and fear. And when the blade touched their skin, they closed their eyes and prayed it was the kind cut, the cut that cured. The red and white pole kept spinning. The line outside stayed long, and through it all, the barber stayed standing, at least until he didn't. So the next time you see a plague mask in a museum, or one of those eerie 17th century paintings of a surgeon lancing a bubo while a terrified assistant holds the patient down, look closer. Chances are the man with the blade wasn't a physician. He was a barber. You stand at the threshold again, blinking into the shadowy barber shop that has, by now, become a familiar nightmare. You've bled, gagged, cringed, and maybe even survived a mild exorcism, all in the name of a simple trim. And just when you think you've seen every tool, treatment, and twisted tradition the medieval barber has to offer, something stranger stirs beneath the surface. This time, the weirdness isn't coming from a rusty scalpel or a jar of eyeball-clearing beetle paste. This time, it's spiritual, because as much as barbers cut and burned and pulled and drained, their practice often brushed against something even more powerful, the church. And when razors met religion, things got bizarre. Let's start with one of the oldest and strangest partnerships in medical history: barbers and monks. See, back in the day, religious life was incredibly structured, and that structure extended to hair. Tonsures, the famous monk haircuts with a bald patch in the middle, weren't just fashion, they were symbols. A sacred haircut that marked devotion, obedience, humility, and giving one, that was no casual affair. Guess who was trusted with the holy shears? Exactly. Barbers were regular visitors to monasteries. In fact, some barbers were practically on staff, making scheduled rounds to shave tonsures, trim beards, and clean up the edges before feast days and pilgrimages. These weren't 5-minute clippers in the garage cuts. They were religious rituals. The way the hair was removed mattered, the shape mattered, even the timing mattered. And when it came to ceremonies, ordination, confession, even penance, cleanliness and grooming were often part of the process. Hair, after all, symbolized vanity and worldliness. Shaving it away, that was an act of spiritual hygiene. So the barber's work became, in a way, an extension of religious practice. Of course, not everyone liked this. Some monks argued it blurred the line between sacred and secular. Was it proper for a man with a dirty apron and a pocket full of tooth fragments to lay hands on the head of a praying brother? Historians still argue whether barbers in monasteries had more power than we give them credit for. Some clearly did. There are records of barbers performing minor medical procedures on monks, treating boils, draining abscesses, even helping with dietary issues using bloodletting. They were a quiet presence in cloisters, unseen but essential. But the relationship didn't stop at the monastery gate. Out in the cities, barbers began to take on an unofficial quasi-priestly role. This is where things really get strange. Imagine, a barber is mid-shave when his client suddenly confesses to a sin, not out of panic, but out of custom. Barbers, always present, always quiet, became informal confessors, especially among the lower classes who rarely saw a real priest. The act of grooming opened people up. Vulnerability, intimacy, a moment of trust. So some barbers started to prepare for it. They'd memorize prayers, keep holy symbols nearby. One Parisian barber in the 14th century kept a small altar in his shop, tucked behind a screen. If a client needed more than a haircut, he'd offer them a stool, a candle, and silence. Not every barber leaned into the spiritual side, but enough did that church officials began to notice and worry. They didn't like barbers playing priest. In some regions, laws were passed to limit how much religious ritual a barber could perform. No more prayers for the dying, no more blessings over poultices, definitely no more confessions. But enforcing those rules, almost impossible. Barbers worked in the cracks of the system. They were healers when no doctors showed up, listeners when no priests were available, and in the chaos of medieval life, plague, famine, war, they became essential stand-ins for both. a man with a razor and a prayer, could do a lot. Take the strange case of the boiling bishop. In 1311, a high-ranking clergyman in Bohemia developed a painful swelling on his leg. The monks prayed, the physicians shrugged, the bishop wept. Enter the barber. He cut the boil, drained it, packed it with wine-soaked cloth, and whispered a blessing. No one knows where he got the words. Some say he was once a monk himself. Others say he simply heard the right phrase and memorized it. Either way, the bishop survived. He later claimed the barber's words healed him more than the blade. You can imagine how that went over with the local clergy. There's even evidence of barbers performing baptisms in emergencies. Technically allowed, but frowned upon. In remote towns, when a baby was born sickly or premature and no priest could be found, the barber, often the one delivering the child, was called upon. A splash of water, a whispered Latin phrase, and the child was sent into life. And maybe heaven if things didn't go well. It wasn't just about proximity, it was about trust. Barbers were in people's homes. They saw life, death, grief, and joy. And so, even as the church frowned and physicians scoffed, they stepped into roles no one else could or would. Of course, the line between medicine and miracle was never clear. One 15th-century Italian barber was known for his angelic hand. Supposedly, every person he bled on Tuesdays recovered. Only Tuesdays. The townspeople believed he had been blessed, or cursed. Either way, they lined up on Tuesday mornings, fasting and hopeful, clutching coins and rosaries. Another barber in rural Spain was said to stop seizures by whispering a forgotten prayer, while slicing a small X over the sufferer's heart with a lancet. Barbaric? Maybe. Effective? Sometimes. Spiritual? Absolutely. It's easy to see why the church was nervous. But they needed the barbers too. In many monasteries, the line between monk and medic was thin. Barbers were trained in herbal lore, wound care, even anatomy. They filled the role of hospitaller, helping care for the sick and injured in monastic infirmaries. And they obeyed the rhythms of the church calendar, fasting days, holy days, feast days. They knew when not to cut, when not to bleed, when to pray instead. It was a delicate dance, a push and pull between medicine and mysticism. And here's the real twist. The tools themselves began to carry symbolic weight. The razor, once just a blade, became something more. A metaphor for sin's removal, the shaving of a scalp, the stripping of pride, the draining of blood, the washing away of spiritual corruption. People began to speak of cutting away sorrow, lancing fear, trimming vice. Even the barber's pole, remember that thing? Took on religious symbolism. Some saw the red and white as the blood and purity of Christ. Others claimed the pole itself echoed the staff of St. Cosmas and St. Damian, the patron saints of medical workers. It was all one tangled braid, spiritual and surgical, sacred and profane. And through it all, the barber remained at the crossroads. Part craftsman, part healer, part confidant, part accidental theologian. In a world ruled by rituals and fear, where divine punishment was blamed for every illness and hope clung to the hem of holy robes, barbers were strange little lanterns of practicality. They didn't have all the answers, but they had hands, they had tools, and sometimes they had a prayer tucked into their apron pocket. So when you think of that old medieval barbershop now, don't just picture the blades and the blood. Picture the candle, the one flickering behind the curtain, next to the altar, just in case. It's late now. The cobblestones are cooling, the streets are emptying, and the only light still glowing comes from the crooked window of the barbershop you can't seem to stay away from. You think it's over? Your wound is dressed, your fever is down, and your dignity is mostly intact. But as you peek through the half-curtained glass, you see something unexpected. They're not cutting anyone. They're talking. Inside, a nobleman leans forward in the chair, one hand resting on the hilt of his jeweled dagger, the other gesturing urgently. The barber listens, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Outside, the world assumes he's just there for a beard trim. But in truth, That shop is a pressure cooker of secrets, because barbers weren't just cutting hair, they were cutting deals. Welcome to the world of barbershop gossip and political intrigue, where whispered names could unseat kings, and a single overheard sentence could decide who slept in a feathered bed and who ended up headless. You have to remember, barbers heard everything. Unlike priests, they weren't bound by formal vows of silence. Unlike nobles, they weren't sealed in privilege. They were liminal creatures, trusted by all, truly owned by none. They were everywhere: courts, monasteries, merchant homes, battlefields. And people talk when there's a blade at their throat. What started as idle chatter, gripes about taxes, complaints about spouses, quickly became something more. Spies, informants, and conspirators realized something. Barbershops were the perfect listening posts. They were gathering spaces, social equalizers, a place where a drunk knight, a desperate merchant, and a weary messenger might sit inches from one another, all airing their miseries to the man with the razor. Barbers often played dumb. They hummed, nodded, chuckled. They kept the rhythm of the scissors going while their clients spilled their treason like loose hair on the floor. And some barbers, they listened carefully. In the courts of France, it wasn't uncommon for barbers to be employed unofficially as informants. They'd mention overheard plans to a local constable, a priest, or even a rival noble. In exchange, they might receive protection, coin, or favors. This wasn't just petty eavesdropping, it could mean life or death. There's a tale from Burgundy, mid-15th century, where a barber supposedly overheard two men plotting to poison a duke. They thought the sound of the sharpening wheel would cover their voices. It didn't. The barber told the duke's steward. The conspirators were arrested that night. The duke slept soundly, with a clean shave the next morning. But barbers weren't just passive recorders of intrigue. Some leveraged what they heard. Let's say you're a barber in a city like Florence. You hear that a certain guildmaster is secretly funneling funds to support a rebellion. You tell the guildmaster's rival. Suddenly, your shop gets new tools. Your taxes disappear. You've become valuable. Others went further. Some barbers blackmailed clients. Subtly, of course. A raised eyebrow, a casual mention of a name. Say, didn't you used to work with that fellow? What was his name? The one who vanished after the bishop's ledger went missing? A smile, a pause, then a sudden reduction in service price. It wasn't just men. Barbering wasn't exclusively male across all regions. In some communities, especially in southern Europe, women who worked in apothecaries or midwifery often offered basic grooming, tooth pulling, or scalp treatments. These women, too, became silent repositories of scandal. Imagine a duchess leaning over for a scalp massage and accidentally revealing that her husband is hiding gold under the wine cellar. And imagine the young woman treating her head, making a quiet note to visit her cousin, who happens to be a very curious thief. Of course, not every whisper was sinister. Sometimes the gossip was just human. Who married whom, who bedded whom, who owed money, who was sick, cursed, or secretly visiting a fortune teller in the next town over. Barbers heard it all. One English barber in the 14th century was known to recite dramatic tales while trimming hair. Fiction, supposedly. But later it was discovered his stories were thinly veiled versions of actual local scandals. He was fined and banned from practicing within the city walls. His shop moved 2 miles out. Business quadrupled, because people didn't just come for grooming, they came for news. In a time before newspapers, barbershops were the medieval Twitter feed. Fast, inaccurate, and wildly entertaining. If someone in the village got married, the barber knew. If someone fled town after a mysterious illness, the barber heard about it before the priest. And if the king's cousin had an illegitimate child with a chambermaid from Bruges, the barber was the first to know, and probably the one who shaved the poor woman's head after her scandal hit court. This role wasn't always welcome. Authorities occasionally cracked down on barbers for idle chatter. In several European cities, ordinances were passed threatening punishment to barbers who spread rumors injurious to noble character. But again, how do you police a profession built on privacy and trust? You don't, not really, which is why barbers became accidental historians. They knew who lived, who died, who changed their name, their religion, their face. They remembered things the scribes never wrote down, the bits of history too messy or petty for the annals. And in their shops, where the walls leaned inward and the floor creaked like an old man's knees, they wove stories into cuts and trims. Sometimes they exaggerated, sometimes they embellished, but often they told the truth, just not always to the right people. One barber in Lübeck is said to have kept a diary, not of his work, but of his clients' secrets. Names, confessions, who plotted what, who bribed whom. The diary vanished after his death, but legend says it still exists, buried behind a wall in what's now a bakery. So if your croissant tastes like treason, now you know why. Even today, remnants of this tradition linger. Modern barbershops still buzz with gossip after all. But in medieval times, it was more than chatter, it was currency. Information was power, and barbers, unknowingly or not, were holding a fortune in whispered gold. So next time you think of a medieval barber, don't picture a blood-soaked apron and a flea-bitten chair. Picture an ear tilted just slightly, eyes half-lidded, blade glinting in the firelight as a powerful man lets his guard down. And remember, sometimes the sharpest weapon in the room wasn't the razor. It was the memory of the man holding it. You can't shake the feeling now that every trim, every stitch, every whispered name in the barbershop meant more than it seemed. And just when you think the blade couldn't possibly have more edges, another one glints in the candlelight. This time, one meant for the dead. Because yes, medieval barbers didn't just serve the living, they served the dying, and sometimes the already dead. You see, grooming in the Middle Ages wasn't just for vanity, it was part of preparation. For court appearances, for church ceremonies, and yes, for the grave. A well-trimmed corpse was considered a sign of respect, and for that, someone needed to hold the razor. Enter the execution barbers. Let's say you're a nobleman who's just been sentenced to death. Maybe you were caught plotting against the king. Maybe you owed someone very important a very large sum of money. Regardless, the sentence is passed. Execution by beheading. Public, of course, because spectacle is everything. But before you're marched to the scaffold, there's a stop to make. The barbers. Why? Because appearances mattered, even in death. Heads were often displayed afterward, on spikes in squares, sometimes even sent to different regions as warnings. The cleaner, more presentable the head, the stronger the message. It had to be shaven, neat, dignified. No blood-caked beard or crusty boils, just a clean cut. In some royal courts, the barbers were directly responsible for preparing the condemned, shaving the neck, trimming the beard, even soothing the prisoner, because a calm man dies more cleanly. There's one account from France where a barber gave a nobleman a warm cloth and a splash of rose water, moments before his head was removed. The man thanked him, twice. It's twisted, yes, but this was standard. And the barbers didn't just serve the condemned. Sometimes they served the executioners too. After all, you wanted that blade sharp. And who better to hone steel than the man who sharpens his own daily? Some barbers doubled as smiths, repairing swords and axes for the gallows team. One German barber even designed a special grindstone specifically for beheading axes. He tested it, on cabbages, probably. But the line between barber and executioner wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. Both professions dealt with flesh, both required steady hands, and both had a strange intimacy with death. There were even barbers who moonlighted as post-mortem caretakers. When someone died at home, especially in wealthier households, the body was often prepared for burial. The barber would arrive, sometimes alongside a priest, and wash the corpse, trim the nails, shave the face. It wasn't just grooming, it was ritual. Think of it like a final act of dignity. A way to cross into the next world, looking like you hadn't suffered, even if you very much had. Then there were the deathbed barbers. In cases of long illness, where death was inevitable, families would call the barber not to cure, but to prepare. The patient, frail and fading, would receive one last trim, a final shave, a cleaning of wounds, or a fresh linen bandage, so they could face the next world properly ordered. Was it necessary? Of course not. But in an age obsessed with signs, omens, and spiritual cleanliness, it offered comfort. A tidy body meant a tidy soul. And if that sounds odd, remember, barbers had already become part-time priests. They knew the prayers, they knew the ritual, they knew when to cut and when to be still. Some even stayed until the last breath. One barber's journal, rare, fragmentary, describes waiting by a merchant's bedside, applying cool cloths and adjusting his posture as the priest muttered final rites. The man died minutes later, his beard freshly oiled, his hair combed back. The family thanked the barber more than they thanked the priest. But even after death, barbers' involvement continued, because someone had to handle the headless. In executions, especially those involving nobility or clergy, the severed heads were sometimes returned to the family, and before they were displayed, buried, or, on rare occasions, preserved, they were groomed. Yes, groomed. You can picture it now. A detached head, laid on a velvet cloth, and a barber crouched beside it, carefully smoothing the hair and beard. Maybe he even applied perfume. Maybe he muttered a prayer. Maybe he tried not to think about how just last week this same man had tipped him for a shave. Macabre? Absolutely. But the medieval world was soaked in death. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't sanitized. And barbers were at the very edge of that world, bridging life and death with a blade and a basin. There's one particularly strange tale from Spain about a duke who insisted on having his hair cut after his beheading. He made the request in writing. "Let me face God with my hair in order," he said. And yes, his barber complied. The head was washed, trimmed, and arranged in state before burial. And speaking of burial, barbers also played a role in funeral grooming. In towns without embalmers, it fell to the barber to make the dead look presentable, clean the face, close the eyes, comb the hair, maybe even stitch a wound shut if the death had been messy. This wasn't just for the deceased, it was for the living, for the family, for the mourners. A peaceful face helped people believe the soul had found peace too. And sometimes, grooming the dead had another, more sinister purpose: disguise. If a noble died of something embarrassing, disease, suicide, murder, the barber might be asked to fix the body, shave away signs of pox, hide bruises, rearrange the clothing to imply a more dignified death. History doesn't always arrive honest. Sometimes it arrives airbrushed by a guy with a comb. And through all this, the barber remained quiet, professional, hands steady, face neutral. Because whether the body was royalty or beggar, sinner or saint, there was work to be done. Cut, clean, close the eyes, move on. It's strange, isn't it? To think the same man who pulled your tooth, gossiped about the bishop, and stitched up your foot after a tavern brawl could also be the last person to touch your face on earth. But that's what made the barber's role so powerful, so eerie. He didn't just serve life, he shadowed its exit. He wasn't just part of society's rituals, he was part of its transitions: birth, illness, healing, death. And if you were lucky, very lucky, he'd make sure your beard looked good on the way out. At this point, you've come to accept it. The medieval barber is more than a figure with a blade. He's an entire institution. Sometimes surgeon, sometimes priest, sometimes mortician. And now, standing on the polished threshold of a royal court, you're about to see the barber in his most dangerous role yet. The man with a blade near a king's throat. It's one thing to scrape a farmer's chin or stitch up a town drunk after a tavern brawl. It's another thing entirely to be trusted with the royal face. And yet, for centuries, kings, queens, princes, and popes all leaned back and bared their necks to the same person, the court barber. You'd think monarchs would keep doctors close, and they did. but physicians were observers, whispering theories about bile and air quality. The barber, he touched you. He saw your bruises. He knew how much you bled. He knew sometimes more than the queen did, and that was both a privilege and a trap. In royal households, barbers were trusted with the body, but only as long as the monarch trusted their loyalty. And when that loyalty was in question, things got ugly, fast. Let's start with a basic truth. Having access to a king's neck every morning is not a position for the faint of heart. In one English court, the barber was required to keep meticulous records of his razors, to ensure none were swapped or tampered with. In another, royal barbers were forbidden from carrying their tools outside palace grounds, lest they be tempted or bribed to use them elsewhere. And yes, poisoned razors were a real fear. It's not a myth. Some assassins genuinely tried to coat blades with toxins. One attempt involved a straight razor, treated with a powdered concoction of crushed glass, herbs, and venom extracted from diseased animals. Another theory, still debated among historians, suggests that a French prince died not from battle wounds, but from a barber's tainted ointment. There are no confirmed cases of a barber actually assassinating a monarch with his tools. But the fear was so potent, so real, that in some courts barbers were frisked before every royal appointment. Their tools were inspected, their hands washed under supervision. Some kings even had the water pre-boiled. Imagine the tension. You're a barber. You step into a marble-floored chamber. Tapestries line the walls. Soldiers stand at attention, and there, on a gold-trimmed chair, sits the most powerful man in the realm. You bow, he nods, and you reach for his neck with a blade. One slip, treason, but if you do your job well, you might gain his ear, literally and politically. Some royal barbers became trusted confidants. After all, what better place to share secrets than the private quarters during an early morning grooming session? The king relaxed, the room quiet, the guards outside. Just the sound of scraping steel and whispered opinions. One French barber in the court of Charles VII was said to have more influence than the bishops. Why? Because he cut the king's hair weekly and always knew the right thing to say. Or, more importantly, what not to say. Others rose even higher. In 16th century Spain, a royal barber named Juan de Escobedo was given control over certain administrative tasks, tracking expenditures, scheduling court events, and even vetting diplomatic visitors. Why him? Because he was discreet, efficient, and, more than anything, always there. That constant presence gave royal barbers an edge over even high-ranking ministers. And yet it was never safe, because power breeds paranoia, and the closer you get to the crown, the closer you are to losing your head. There are tales, dark, unverified, of barbers being executed on suspicion alone. One in Naples vanished after an overheard rumor connected him to a failed poisoning. Another was accused of cutting too deeply during a routine neck shave and was imprisoned for years, only to die in chains. Even when they weren't accused, royal barbers were often scapegoats. A king falls ill? Maybe it was the oils used during his morning massage. A queen miscarries? Perhaps the hot towel the barber prepared was cursed. The razor, the scent, the touch. Barbers worked at the nerve center of anxiety, a dangerous blend of intimacy and responsibility. Still, many of them endured, and some thrived, turning their proximity into political power. There's even evidence that royal barbers were used as go-betweens for secret communications. They were unassuming, ever-present, and often allowed into private chambers when others were not. In one instance, a Scottish noble passed a secret message to the queen through her barber, who delivered it under the pretense of bringing a new shaving balm. The message sparked a scandal. The barber was exiled, but the queen, she kept shaving. This leads to one of the more absurd yet true facts. Royal barbers often made more money than some knights. Yes, knights risked their lives on the battlefield. Barbers risked a razor slip. But guess which one the king saw first every morning? It wasn't about the sword, it was about trust. And despite the danger, being a royal barber had perks. They lived in palace quarters. They were fed from the royal kitchens. They received fine linens, rare oils, and on occasion silk capes. Because nothing says, "You can trust me with your jugular," like a little fashion. Some even traveled with the court. When kings went on campaign, barbers came too, not just to keep them tidy, but to tend wounds, ease headaches, and offer basic medical care. These weren't battlefield surgeons, but they were battlefield comforts, because when your army's lost half its men, and you're camped in mud, a hot towel and a sharp shave can feel like salvation. Strangely, barbers were sometimes expected to entertain as well. In the Spanish court, royal barbers were occasionally summoned during feasts, not just to groom, but to perform songs, stories, or light music. Not officially part of their job, but expected, because who doesn't want a little loot with their lather? Historians still debate how much of this role was based on talent versus survival instinct. But the fact remains, royal barbers were part groomer, part medic, part court jester, part spy, and all of it revolved around one dangerous, glittering truth. Every morning, the most powerful people in the world invited a man with a blade to stand inches from their throat, and trusted him not to use it. That's not just professional skill, that's political theater. That's psychological warfare dressed in velvet and scented oils. So next time you imagine a king preparing for battle, or a queen facing an uneasy council, picture the moment before, the silence, the towel, the razor gliding down the cheek, and the barber, steady-handed, eyes down, listening, always listening. You've followed the barber from battlefield to throne room, from plague ward to execution scaffold. You've seen him bathe the dying and trim the hair of the soon-to-be dead. You've heard whispers of treason and hymns muttered under a steady razor hand. But now things get weird. Because the next chapter in the barbershop saga is a bubbling cauldron of froth, foam, and fermented cures. Yes, barbers were surgeons, dentists, confidants. But they were also apothecaries in disguise, cooking up potions and pastes that defy modern logic and stretch the limits of medieval creativity. You didn't just go to the barber for a cut. You went for an ointment, a salve, a mouth rinse, a poultice so questionable that it may have come with side effects like spontaneous fainting or dreams of talking livestock. Let's start with the basics. Barber's balms. These were homemade remedies designed to soften skin, ease pain, and, ideally, prevent infection. Common ingredients: lard, beeswax, mint, rosemary, camphor, and wine, all perfectly reasonable, until they added fermented goat milk and powdered snail shells. Yes, snails. The theory was that the shell's cooling properties would draw out heat from inflamed wounds. Historians still argue whether this was based on any actual results, or if someone just dropped a snail into a jar once and called it divine intervention. But it didn't stop there. For skin conditions like boils, barbers used pastes made from butter, ash, and ox gall. That's bile, animal bile, mixed with burnt plant matter and smeared over the skin like medieval neosporin. If it stung, they said it was working. If it burned, working better. And for the scalp, they had shampoos. A particularly popular one included ale, crushed rosemary, and egg yolk. The yolk was supposed to bind oils, the rosemary gave a pleasant scent, and the ale was, well, ale. People thought anything fermented had a kind of purifying energy. Whether it cleaned your scalp or just made you smell like a tavern lunch, no one can say for sure. Barbers also experimented with what today we might call aromatherapy. They burned sage, lavender, or cow dung. Yes, you read that right. To cleanse the air. The theory? Sickness traveled through bad smells. So if you filled the room with a stronger smell, whether it was flowers or flaming manure, you were protecting yourself. The logic may be lacking, but the commitment? Unquestionable. For sore throats and toothaches there were rinses. Wine boiled with cloves, vinegar infused with garlic, even potions that involved steeping leather scraps in salt water and having you gargle the brew. One record from the 15th century claims that chewing dried frogs could relieve jaw pain. Another suggests that urine aged 3 days could clear mouth ulcers. It's unclear whether these worked or if patients simply became too horrified to keep complaining. Then there was the dreaded Barbers plaster, a thick, sticky mix applied to wounds, rashes, or even chest pains. Ingredients varied wildly, but one common blend included beeswax, rendered pig fat, black pepper, and sometimes ground-up earthworms. The worms, people believed, had natural regenerative properties. Or maybe they were just cheap. Did any of this actually work? Sometimes. Honey, for example, has antimicrobial properties. So does vinegar. Wine, with its alcohol content, might have helped clean minor wounds. Camphor and rosemary have known anti-inflammatory effects. So in a strange, patchwork way, some of these medieval mixes actually had merit, albeit buried under a mountain of nonsense and old wives' tales. Still, the line between medicine and superstition was as blurry as a barber's vision after too much worm balm. One particularly memorable recipe from a 14th century apothecary barber's book included crushed pearls and dried rose petals, mixed with lamb's blood, and applied to the forehead to restore mental clarity. Whether it did that or just caused a rash is anyone's guess. Some barbers believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that like heals like. So for burns, they applied substances that were themselves once burnt. For infections, they'd dab on moldy bread, assuming the rot would draw out illness. That last one, surprisingly, not entirely wrong. Penicillin, after all, was discovered in mold, so maybe they were accidentally brilliant. There's even a story, half legend, half record, of a barber in Vienna who treated battle wounds using a mixture of egg white, pine sap, and powdered silver coins. He insisted it would bless the blood. His patients? Some died, some lived, and one wrote a poem thanking him for the balm that made the pain holy. Let's not forget internal tonics. Barbers didn't just rub things on you, they made you drink them. These tonics were billed as cures for general weakness, wandering womb, or excessive melancholy. Ingredients included things like ground antlers, sheep's heart, snake skin, or boiled plum wine with crushed nutmeg and honey. Fancy, foul, and full of optimism. And then there were the potions with no name, passed down in barber families, scrawled in the margins of ledgers, wrapped in superstition. One German barber refused to share the ingredients of his famous fever tincture. He died without telling anyone. His grandson found the bottle decades later. Inside, dried beetle wings, elderberries, and what looked suspiciously like powdered bone. As terrifying as these concoctions were, they offered something people desperately wanted: control. In a world where illness struck without warning and death was a constant neighbor, these potions, salves, and syrups gave the illusion of power. You could do something. You could fight back. And the barber? He was the gatekeeper to this homemade apothecary. He might not know Latin or the precise shape of a spleen, but he'd memorized herbs, adjusted his blends, and paid attention. If 2 patients improved after using eel oil, he'd recommend it. If one died after sniffing nutmeg too hard, he'd stop. It was a grim kind of trial and error, but it was still experience. And you'd drink the tonic, gag a little, lie down in the back room with a damp rag, and hope your dreams didn't feature frogs again. Because when the barber mixed you something, you didn't just get medicine, you got hope. Wrapped in rosemary, doused in ale, and maybe sprinkled with something he found under the floorboards. You walk out of the shop with your pouch a little lighter and your tongue a little numb. Was it the mint, the vinegar, the goat bile? You'll never know. But for now, your headache is gone, and that's enough. You step back onto the street, your scalp tingling faintly with the remnants of egg yolk and ale, your mouth still tasting vaguely of clove and vinegar. Your skin glows, not with health, but with the faint shimmer of rendered animal fat and crushed rosemary. Still, you feel okay, alive. mostly intact, maybe even a little bit better. And that's where we find ourselves now, in the slow, bumpy rise of the professional barber. Because somewhere between the leech jars and plague knives, people started asking, should these guys actually be licensed to do this stuff? Spoiler, the answer didn't come quickly, or cleanly. For centuries, barbering was the Wild West of medicine. Skill learned by watching, failure measured in funerals. But by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the world started to change. Cities grew, trade boomed, universities blossomed, and with them came a rising obsession with standards. And suddenly, the barber surgeon couldn't just be a guy with a blade and a good story. He needed credentials. It started, as many things do, with guilds. Guilds were like ancient unions, mixed with social clubs, and a dash of secret society flair. You couldn't just open a barber shop in a big city anymore. You had to join the local barbers' guild. That meant paying dues, following rules, and learning under a master for years before you were allowed to wield a blade professionally. In Paris, the Confrérie de Saint-Côme, named after the patron saints of medicine, Cosmas and Damien, emerged in the 13th century as a surgical brotherhood. Eventually, they split into two parts: surgeons who trained with books, and barbers who trained with blood. The surgeons considered themselves above the barbers. The barbers didn't necessarily agree, but in practice, they were stuck in a strange dance. Surgeons couldn't work without practical training, and barbers were that practical training. The tension simmered for centuries. By the 14th and 15th centuries, this professionalization movement was gaining momentum. You start seeing actual written curricula for barber surgeons. Apprentices learned not just how to wield the fleam or the tooth key, but also how to identify fractures, treat battlefield wounds, and, gasp, read anatomy diagrams. In England, the moment of clarity came in 1540, when Henry VIII merged the Fellowship of Surgeons and the Company of Barbers into a single, terrifyingly named body, the Company of Barber Surgeons. Here's how it worked. Barbers were allowed to shave, cut hair, pull teeth, and perform minor surgeries, like bleeding and lancing. Surgeons were allowed to do the more complex stuff: amputations, internal surgeries, setting broken bones. Barbers were not allowed to perform major surgeries. Surgeons, oddly enough, were not allowed to cut hair or shave beards. This created a strange and comical overlap. Imagine a patient hobbling in with a leg injury and a scraggly beard, needing both to be fixed. The barber would take care of the beard, and then the surgeon would jump in for the leg, each standing politely to the side while the other worked, like a relay race with bandages. In practice, things were messier. Roles bled into each other, sometimes literally, but the effort to draw a line between grooming and medicine was real and increasingly enforced. Guilds issued licenses, some even conducted exams. You had to demonstrate your skills, present your tools, and sometimes perform in front of a panel. Fail, and you went back to sweeping the shop. Pass, and you got to wear the apron, hang your pole, and start draining veins like the semi-professional you now were. Still, access to training remained uneven. If you lived in a big city, Paris, London, Florence, you had access to guild resources, apprenticeships, and even lectures. But if you lived in the countryside, you were probably still learning the trade by gut instinct and wild experimentation. Yet even the rural barbers began to feel the shift. Printed books, rare but spreading, started to outline best practices. Translations of Galen, Hippocrates, and Islamic medical texts gave barber surgeons a sense of ancient prestige. Some barbers even carried miniature scrolls with medical terms they barely understood but loved to quote when clients got nervous. "Ah, yes," they'd say, "your humors are congested in the spleen, which explains the twitching. We'll balance it with a vinegar soak and a precise incision just here." Based on Avicenna's treatise, of course. Was it real science? Not always, but it sounded official. By the 17th century, the push for professionalization took another leap. Surgeons in England finally broke away from barbers entirely. In 1745, They formed the Company of Surgeons, a precursor to today's Royal College of Surgeons. Barbers were officially out. No more surgeries, no more anatomy lectures. Just scissors, razors, and shampoo. Well, sort of. Some barbers resisted, quietly. In rural areas, they continued to pull teeth and lance boils. The clients weren't complaining. In fact, some preferred the barber to the highfalutin surgeon with a powdered wig and no practical experience. One man was quoted in a London pamphlet saying, "The barber's knife hath more mercy than the surgeon's saw." But officially, the barber's role was shrinking. The red and white pole remained, but now it was just a memory, a relic. The last spinning symbol of an age where your haircut might come with a touch of bloodletting and a prayer muttered over your liver. Some barbers adapted. They leaned into fashion, wigs, powder, mustache curling, shaving as a form of art. Others became tooth drawers or cupper bleeders, specialists in what was still legally allowed. A few vanished altogether, and yet the legacy endured. The professional barber you see today, crisp white jacket, pristine scissors, shelf lined with tonics, is a polished descendant of the blood-splattered, wine-swigging, frog ointment-slinging survivor of medieval madness. They don't lance boils anymore, thank goodness. But they do hold something of that original energy, the mix of ritual and rhythm, touch and transformation. And in a strange way, barbers helped create modern medicine. They forced the conversation about who could heal, about what counted as knowledge, about the tension between experience and theory, action and observation. They didn't always get it right, far from it. But they got dirty when others stayed clean. They tried things, they learned. They passed that knowledge on, not in Latin, but in scars and stories. So now, as you sit in a modern chair with relaxing music playing overhead and lavender-scented foam lathering your jawline, take a second, close your eyes, listen to the faint echo of history beneath the buzz of clippers, and know that once this moment would have started with a prayer and maybe ended with leeches. And here you are. One last walk past that swirling red and white pole. One last step over the threshold of history's most misunderstood business. You've sat in the chair, you've bled, gossiped, prayed, cringed, and maybe even healed a little, and now it's time to let go. But not before we finish the story, because while the razors dulled and the blood drained away from their trade, barbers didn't vanish. They evolved, slowly, uneasily, from the shadowy edge of medicine to the respectable center of style. Let's rewind to that crucial fracture point, the mid-18th century, when the Company of Surgeons formally split from the barbers in England. The divide was final. Barbers were told, politely but firmly, "You're not doctors, you're not surgeons, you're just barbers." And in many ways, that was the beginning of the end. Not of barbering itself, but of barbering as a medical craft. No more amputations, no more bloodletting, at least not legally, no more leeches in jars or lanced buboes by candlelight. Instead, barbers returned to their roots, grooming. You might think this demotion would have crushed the profession. But here's the twist. It liberated them. Freed from the expectations of healing every wound or draining every fever, barbers could now perfect their artistry. And over time, they did. In the 1800s, barbershops blossomed into places of routine and respectability. The tools became more refined, the chairs more comfortable, the services more standardized. Haircut, shave, beard trim, repeat. Barbers began learning style. They experimented with tonics, oils, and grooming rituals imported from France, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Mustache wax became a thing. Beard oils were concocted with sandalwood and bergamot. Pomades were no longer made from animal fat, but blended with scent and sophistication. And perhaps most important of all, the barbershop became social again. Gone were the cries of patients and the reek of opened wounds. In their place came conversations, laughter, stories. The barbershop became a place where men, and eventually women, came not just to look better, but to feel better, to connect, to share news, to sit still for a moment and let someone else take care of them. In America, barbershops took on a particularly powerful role in black communities. Post-slavery, black barbers became entrepreneurs, one of the few professions where black men could own businesses, gain wealth, and shape their own futures. Their shops were more than grooming centers. They were hubs of culture, conversation, and resistance. The echoes of the old barber surgeon remained, especially in the tools. The straight razor still looked like something you'd fear on a battlefield. The strop, the scissors, the brush. They were all descendants of instruments once used on battlefields and in plague wards. And yes, the pole stayed. That's the part that really sticks with you, isn't it? The red and white swirl still spins outside countless barbershops, completely disconnected from its bloody origins. It's decor now, branding, a nostalgic icon. Few know it once meant, you can get your vein opened here. Fewer still know how deeply entwined that pole is with surgery, death, dignity, and disease. And maybe that's the most fascinating thing about all of it. We've sanitized the story. We turned the barber surgeon, equal parts healer, hazard, and hero, into a humble hairdresser. We gave him a clean coat and a quiet shop. We swapped his leeches for lotion. We made him less frightening. But beneath the scented oils and the sleek product shelves, the legacy still hums. A history not just of snips and trims, but of boldness. Barbers were never just about appearance. They were about survival. They acted when no one else would. They cut. They stitched. They listened. They tried. And they left scars, literal ones, on faces, on arms, on history itself. Even now, there's something comforting about sitting in that chair. Something ancient, primal even. The soft drag of a blade across your neck. The gentle hum of conversation. The warm towel. It's ritual. It's trust. It's a whisper from a time when those moments might have been your last. So if you ever find yourself watching the spin of that red and white pole outside a quiet barbershop at dusk, remember this. You're not just looking at a place to get your sides cleaned up. You're looking at one of humanity's oldest, weirdest, most tenacious professions. A trade that navigated the plague, touched popes, heard kings' secrets, and buried the dead, and still found time to invent shampoo. Not bad for the guy with the scissors. So now, just for a moment, slow your breath. Let the noise of medieval madness settle into the background like the soft closing of a heavy wooden door. The pole outside is still spinning, yes, but tonight, it's quiet. It's no longer an invitation for bloodletting or bone setting, but a memory, a marker, a soft beacon glowing in the dark. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a worn stone floor. You've wandered centuries tonight, crossed warfields, royal courts, and plague-ridden alleyways. You've stepped into the shoes of a man with a blade in one hand and hope in the other. And you've seen how even the strangest, bloodiest history can shape the most ordinary corners of your life. Now picture that barbershop one last time, but this time it's peaceful. The tools are clean, the shelves are lined with jars of herbs, not horrors. The chair is empty, the candles are low, the air smells faintly of rosemary and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance someone is humming. Not Gregorian chant, just something soft, something old. You made it through the story. The sharp edges have dulled, the panic has passed, and now all that's left is quiet. Your body sinks into stillness, your breath deeper, slower, your eyelids heavier, and in that silence, the strange comfort of history wraps around you like a well-worn cloak, reminding you that even the weirdest past can soften at the edges, can fade into calm, into warmth, into sleep.